Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this excellent conference. It's really an honor to be here. And I think what we recognize in the United Nations is that we really need to work together. Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is a all of society action. It requires absolutely the entrepreneurs to work with government and civil society to get it done. So I feel very honored to be invited. Difficult act to follow, so the bar is high, but I really appreciated the earlier presentation as well, which really indicates that to get the SDGs done, it requires changes in the people's values and the way that what is our bottom line? Is it just a commercial bottom line, or do we really see the need for a triple bottom line of economy, social and environmental? So I'll kind of build on this theme as I present what we're doing now. So the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, you're familiar with it, and what I love about it is that it's not a mysterious thing which some professors somewhere conjured up and the UN has been trying to enforce on the rest of the world, but it is basically the stuff that excites us, the stuff that sometimes keeps us awake at night. You know, we're all looking for a world where poverty is reduced, you know. We all want a world where people can be treated as equals, where women and men are equals, and where there are opportunities for our youth to get educated, where as we see changes in climate patterns and the rains don't come as they used to come and the heat is much hotter or whatever it is, you know, we also see the need to really accelerate our achievement of the SDGs and address issues such as climate. And in different places that I go, there are different priorities. For instance, even last week I was in Portugal, and they share this amazing coast that you have of the Atlantic, and they're trying to work on how to deal with the issue of fish, the underwater environment, the surfers, the tourists, the fishermen, and so that we share the benefits of the natural resources around us. So I think the SDGs are a fantastic agenda because they just resonate with everyone, everywhere. And I think it's important now we've got 8 years left, so we're really concerned now, what are going to be the accelerators of achieving SDGs? And what is the role of business and entrepreneurship in that? The question we're asking in UN Habitat, so the UN has many different agencies that sort of specialize in different things. So UN Habitat is the UN agency that specializes in cities and in housing and urban development. So we're wondering, can our cities be our hope for achieving the SDGs? And if we look at, have we got a flashlight here? I don't know. No, I think I've just switched my presentation off. Okay. So what we've seen in the last decade, actually, just in the last 2 decades, is a fundamental and global transition from a world that's been predominantly urban ever since the world was created to a world that is now predominantly urban. And this transition actually took place in 2008. And what we see is, if we look at the map at the top, the green, I don't know why they chose these colors, but the green is actually where there's a higher urban density, and the brown is where it's a low urban density. And we see that the global north was urbanizing, probably following industrialization, etc. And then we see that most of the global south was less than 50% urban. And just between 1960 and 2020, in a period of around 60 years, we've seen dramatic changes. We've seen most of Latin America go from rural to urban. We've seen most of Asia go from rural to urban, and a lot of Africa as well. And what's interesting now in Africa is that I think in Ghana we're about 57% urban, which is about in line with the global average. But across Africa, we're just under 50%. It's something like 43%. But Africa is urbanizing very, very fast. It's the fastest urbanizing continent. And that that can't be reversed. We've got to work with it. So the question is, how do we work with rapid urbanization to make this a real driving force for sustainability, and what is the role of real estate and entrepreneurship in this? What we're seeing also with these trends is that you see at the map on north at the top, these are looking at slums. So this is an indicator of whether urbanization is working well or not, you know. And what we see is as people move to cities, particularly when people move rapidly to cities, cities are really struggling to keep up with the demand. So they're struggling to generate the infrastructure to plan the city ahead of people moving in. And particularly when people move to larger cities where they hope to find employment opportunities, etc., we're seeing more and more slums happening. But also what's quite interesting is if we compare the top and the bottom, if we look at, say, Latin America and Asia, we find that whereas most of the cities had so many slums then, back in 1960, that has actually started to improve. So it seems that when cities have been around for a while, they do start dealing with the problem of slums. And we see then in Africa, where we've seen much more recent acceleration of urbanization, that there's a huge proportion of the urban population living in slums. And this creates a challenge in our cities, because that's where you really see inequality. You see, you know, some people living very well in very nice villas in the city, playing golf or whatever, alongside people living in poverty. And this inequality, and when I was introduced to someone who's worked in the Arab states. I was there for 8 years during the Arab Spring. And we see inequality in cities being a real driving force for conflict and for civil unrest. So, but what we're also finding is that the curve in the global north is flattening. So urbanization is slowing down. And we see that in Africa and Asia, urbanization is still moving very rapidly. And so where urbanization is happening rapidly, on one hand we have some of the greatest opportunities, and I like what they were saying earlier about crisis. You know, is it a crisis or is it an opportunity? And we need to see this as an opportunity. So on one hand, we see that cities, they generate economies. About 57% of the world's population live in cities, but 80% of economy is driven in cities. I think a lot of you who are investors are probably investing in cities because cities have a great economic potential. But also by bringing people together, their ideas and their backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, you're also generating ideas. So cities are also real hubs for innovation. So cities, on one hand, provides a really important opportunity to advance sustainability, because they're generating economy, and they're generating ideas, and they're generating innovation. On the other hand, cities are also generating 70% of the world's greenhouse gases, 70% of global waste, and as mentioned, that growing inequalities in cities are a real trigger for conflict. So it's been generally recognized that the battle for sustainable development will be won or lost in cities. And we'll see in the decade to come whether it's been won or lost. We have 8 years left to achieve the SDGs. So what we find then, when we really look at urbanization, we find that if cities are just left to expand on their own, and there's not much planning behind it, there's not much infrastructure investment, not much policy thinking about this, then we do see a propagation of slums, we do see a propagation of inequality, and we see that the economy of the city is favored towards a small amount of the elite. But once cities are well planned, when they're well governed, and when the city leaders are genuinely listening to people, when they have effective institutions, effective revenue systems, etc., they're able to manage themselves in a way that's sustainable. So a well-managed city can actually produce the SDGs, can actually be a real leading force for sustainable development. Back in 2016, we looked at what are the factors that can make cities successful. And there was what in 2015, the world launched, the 193 member states of the UN launched the Sustainable Development Goals. A year later, they got together in Quito in Ecuador to come up with what's called the New Urban Agenda. This happened at the Habitat 3 Summit. And they recognized that countries need policies, and they need national development policies, but they need to see how can cities implement these things. And they recognized then the need for accountable, inclusive governance, the good planning, and investment in sustainable infrastructure, and good revenue systems. So these are the key ingredients that make cities successful. And you can see how it works, that density brings about people together in close proximity. That generates economy, and economy should generate revenue. When you generate revenue, you can then reinvest in infrastructure. When you reinvest in infrastructure, you improve the economy. With good governance, that economic sort of value chain of continued improvement, it's for the shared benefit of everyone. But when the city is governed in a poor and inadequate way, then that economic sort of spiral just benefits the rich. So that's why governance is so important in this. Now, when we look at in the 30 years ahead, we're expecting a population of 2.5 billion people to come to the world's cities. So urbanization is not slowing down; it's happening very fast, particularly in Africa. Now, if we think that only just over 500 of those cities have a population of 1 million and above, and what we're seeing generally is people are moving to larger cities because they think in larger cities that they have more opportunities. So if you think of here in Accra, people are moving to Accra, they're moving to Kumasi, and if there are only 500 cities that are 1 million or more, and this 2.5 billion people are going to move to the major cities, then they won't cope. They won't cope with that demand. The demand for people moving to cities will be far and above what cities can manage in terms of providing sustainable infrastructure. So that will automatically generate more slums. But if we look at smaller cities, we find that there are more than 4,000 cities that have a population of 100,000 or less. Now, why are people not moving to those cities as much? Sometimes it's because they're not very well connected. Maybe they don't have energy. They don't have the infrastructure to be able to drive business. But what if they had? Then you could say that 2.5 billion growth that we're expecting in the next 30 years, if they could come to smaller cities, then that would not only manage the pace of urbanization in such a way that doesn't generate slums, but it will also reap a nice balanced economic benefits across the whole country, but also create more opportunities for urban and rural linkages and better economies, territorial economies, when we look at value chains. So the appeal here really is to start looking seriously at smaller cities. Now, I work with different investors, and a lot of investors say, look, well, small cities don't generate a huge pipeline of projects. This is why we're going for large cities. If we by the time we've done a due diligence on a small city, the opportunities is not going to generate huge pipeline. Is it really worth it? So we need, as the UN or as development partners or the private sector, to find ways to channel investment effectively to tens of thousands or at least thousands of small cities instead of just focusing on the big capitals. So we need to think about how do we do that. I firmly believe that small and secondary cities provides our second chance to get urbanization right. I'd love to see how investing in smaller cities provides the opportunity to have a new wave of cities that just don't have slums anymore, where inequality is less and the local economies are strong. So we've started now to embark on a program called SDG Cities, and we want to work across maybe 1,000 cities worldwide. And we're launching at the moment 10 cities in Ghana. So we recognize that if cities know, if they have the data, if they know what their challenges are and what their opportunities are, And if they can identify what are their priorities for accelerating the SDGs. So in some places it might be, well, we really need to bring the internet in, or we need to bring in electricity, or we need to improve water supply, or we need to be more connected with roads, etc. So if they knew what their priorities were, and if they built effective local institutions, and I guess as investors you're looking for strong institutions, trustworthy institutions, longevity, so that you know that the legal system and the land system and the tax system, these are all going to be consistent. You're not going to be suddenly finding that land that you've bought is suddenly going to be owned by someone else. So we need strong local institutions. And then we need to identify those high impact projects and achieve them by 2030. So and not only identify those high impact projects, but to finance them. And globally, we see that there's a, we sometimes are told, okay, the private sector is that sort of a silver bullet that we need for now investing in the impact we need, because there's so much ESG funds out there. And that's true, but cities also need, there needs to be a partnership. Cities need to have good public financial management, they need to have good revenue systems, and they need to attract investment. And these things need to go hand in hand. And I remember a governor in Kenya, on a big city on Lake Kisumu, they've designed this amazing lakeside development. And the governor's coming to us and say, can you help us find investment for this? And it would be great for some of you guys to visit this city, Kisumu. But when we looked at their revenue system, we kind of figured, well, maybe you're not quite ready for this investment yet, because there's a lot of homework that you need to do to get your revenue systems working, so that if you do take up debt finance or even private sector partnerships, you're able to service that debt. So it's not like the investments coming in making this current governor look great, but then the next governor needs to pay the debt. So we really need good partnerships of private sectors with cities, so that message is coming through strongly. There's an onus on city leaders to do a lot to create the ground that's favorable for investment. But it's also important for investors to get involved. I mean, I know a lot of investors, they don't like to get too involved in the real upstream stuff, because that takes a long time, and what investors are often looking for is something presented that's ready to go. But I do urge you guys in real estate and investment to come alongside city leaders, to kind of advise them on what do they need to do to make their city attractive for investment. What are the kind of institutional things? What are the sort of legislations, the regulations that you need? What kind of public financial management systems do you expect as a kind of bottom line to make that possible? And I think cities have never really had to deal with investors, and they really do now in order to accelerate the SDGs. So we're hoping that it could be possible to have stronger partnerships between and stronger dialogue between city leaders and investors. So this program of SDG Cities has kind of these components where we work with data, and in Ghana there's loads of data available. But sometimes that data is not telling us the story, and you heard about storytelling earlier. The data really needs to tell a story. If you're just looking at spreadsheets of data, what's that telling me about my city? What's that telling me about my country or my territory? So that data really needs to be synthesized so that we understand what it's telling us. And that data needs to inform a strategic plan. And we strongly believe in a strategic planning process that helps cities to identify what are their priorities. And that process needs to be very inclusive and accountable. That's what makes or break. If a mayor just comes up with, gets a consultant, comes up with some real flash strategy, but nobody knows about it, nobody believes in it, then it will just sit on the shelf. And what's important is what we were talking about earlier, and what we call in the UN, all of society approach. People of the cities need to get engaged in that planning process. That's not just the youth and communities that are left behind, women and civil society, but the business community has an extremely important role in this. And we want to open that dialogue between the business community and the civil society and city government to be able to really reach a solid plan. And I think in terms of investment, this is not only important to ensure that, as per the SDGs, we're not leaving anyone behind, we're leaving no one behind, but that's important for longevity, because mayors change. And the last thing you need as an investor is to spend 2 or 3 years working on a pipeline of projects, and then once you've signed the deal, the mayor leaves a year later, and the deal's off, the new mayor comes along and just wants to do something different. So this city ownership of strategies, and with business being part of that process, is really important, so that when the new mayor comes on board, whether it's elected or appointed, that new mayor is still delivering the plan of the city and not just coming up with their own thing. And to do that, local ownership is so important. And then from that, we need to identify the projects. And these projects obviously need to be financed. So there's a kind of a value chain of data to strategic plans, the city ownership of the strategic plan, the people's ownership of this, followed by the identification of the high impact projects, followed by the financing of those projects. And this doesn't happen without strong institutions. You need institutions that deliver in an inclusive way, planning that's conducive. I like the idea of planning, and I'm sure a lot of your work in real estate deals with planning. And UN Habitat have developed 7 principles of sustainable planning, because a good plan with good density, good connectivity, good street layouts, plenty of public space actually delivers very well on economy, because you have an efficient plan, and mixed use, by the way. So these gated communities don't really do much for sustainability. Even housing developments don't, but mixed use really do, because there you can more or less walk from where you work to where you go, where you live to where you work, where your kids go to school, where you might go out and meet your friends in the evening and all that sort of thing. These compact plans are absolutely key for driving social, environmental and economic aspects of sustainability. And you can just look at UN Habitat Sustainable Neighborhood Planning, but they also generate great land value as well. So there's a lot to be said for getting the plans right. Then, as mentioned before, we need good revenue systems and effective service delivery. And these things all come together to make cities prosperous and effective. I won't go into detail about each of these tracks, but one of the ways that we're trying to work with cities to get there, and we're working across we aim to work across 1,000 cities. We used to fly our experts here, there, and everywhere, but now we've just put all of our tools online. So if you're doing data collection, in fact, just in Mombasa a couple of weeks ago, data sometimes exists, sometimes it exists, but you can't get hold of it. What we did is with the youth, they just collected data on their phones. So we have, it's a bit like SurveyMonkey you might have had, where you just fill out a questionnaire. But this actually georeferences where you're standing when you do the questionnaire. So you talk about your street. Does it have paving? Does it have lighting? What are the issues of the street? Are the cars going really fast on it? Or, you talk about your public space, you talk about the school, you talk about the clinic, you talk about the garbage, and you take a photo while you're at it. And in about 2 weeks or 10 days with 30 young people in Mombasa, we collected 3,000 data points, and that's been generated into a map. So you can understand not only the data of the city, but you can start understanding the differences from one part of the city to another. And what we need then is analysis, and we call it spatial analysis. So it's not just the employment, what is the employment figure for the city, but what's the employment figure for that neighborhood versus that one? What proportion in that neighborhood have walking distance to public transport or walking distance to a public space? How many kids in one classroom in that district compared to that district? And this is a type of data we need to really make the much more a clear link between the data and the investment needs of the city. So we want this process then to be easy, simple, good enough. We don't need it to be so scientific, but it needs to be good enough, robust enough to be able to say, okay, you know what? We're going to need to invest in classrooms there. We need to invest in street lighting there. We need to invest in waste compactors there. So this is data. The next track then is a strategic planning process. So we do the basic analytics, but we do what's called SWOT. I think you're aware of SWOT: strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, and threats. And then we engage people in that process, and that's part of the ownership thing. And then that goes to a vision, a strategic objectives, and then your strategic plan and your capital investment plans. So we want every city then to have a list of capital investment plans. What are their investment priorities? And then from there, sorry about that. When we look at institutions, we're looking at their revenue systems, we're looking at their planning systems, their governance systems. Revenue I find very interesting. I work a lot in East Africa. So many cities there, we've got a global database, and so we're able to figure out what is the optimum revenue for a particular city. And then we can look at, and then they fill in all this data and they tell us what is the actual revenue. And in a lot of the East African cities we've been working on, they're achieving about 10% of what they're legally, based on on the legal system, allowed to collect. And we found that 90% of the revenue generated through parking fees is spent on just the staff that are collecting the fees. So you might be generating jobs, but you're not generating revenue that way. And then there's usually a huge gap on property taxation, and this is like single transaction per year. So you don't need loads of tax collectors, but you just need a good system for it, Massive gap there, massive gap on business licensing, and then just small bits of money coming from market fees and parking fees. So if you have that analysis and focus on the right thing, and in a town called Kiambu in Kenya, we tripled their revenue just in 3 years. And in Hargeisa last year, in Somalia, of all places, or Somaliland, they increased their revenue by 2 million just in 1 year, and this is a kind of a conflict type of location. So there's a lot you can do if you get the right advice. And then the last one then is investment in impact. And so here we're creating what's called a city investment facility. So we start off with a portal. So it's one thing for the cities to have done this strategic planning process and they know what their investment needs are, but how are you going to share that with the world, and how are you going to share that with investors? So we've created what's called the City Investment Portal. You can see at the bottom there's a link to it, and you can see what the project's coming up. But we found that just being able to have a global portal with projects on it is not enough, The investors are not biting, And the problem we've had, and so what we're told is that there's trillions of dollars there worldwide, ESG, environment, social governance, and as the shareholders of banks are getting younger, and younger than my generation, they want to see that the banks and the finance sources are really investing in the future, in their future and the kids' future. So they're looking at environmental, they want to make sure that investments are really good in terms of environmental safeguarding and social safeguarding. They're done with corruption, so they want to make sure that the governance is good. So I think 1/3 of global assets under management now are coming under this ESG. And I think BlackRock has even said that all of its $9 billion are coming under the banner of ESG. So you've got a huge amount of funds that could go into high-impact SDG projects. And then you've got emerging and developing economies that could be new avenues for investments, great new opportunities. I mean, the OECD countries are interesting, but they only generate a certain return. Everybody knows that market, but this is a new emerging economy. So, and there are great ESG projects coming up, but in between, there's this valley of death. The money's there, and the projects are there, but in between, there's a valley of death. And the last report by Convergence, you're probably aware of this blended finance idea, where public and private sources come together to be able to deliver impact. And this was like the silver bullet in the Addis conference in 2015. This is what's going to finance development. And to this day, only $8 billion worldwide is being spent on this blended model in the global south. So, you know, $8 billion is just a drop in the ocean, really. And last year, and the year, well, 2021, because of COVID, it was down to $4 billion. And the thing is, cities have never had to do this. You know, cities might have great design departments, they might have great engineers, and they're able to do the design and the bills of quantity and the calculations and all the rest of it, and know exactly how much something is going to cost. But I guess you guys are not, that's not really what matters. You know, yes, you need to know the costs, but you need to know the IRR, the return rate. You need to know what the risks. You need to know who else is in the game. What are going to be the co-investors? If you're an international investor, how are we going to manage the currency risk? There's a lot of stuff, and cities and even national governments have never had to do this stuff. So I think part of the problem that we're finding is that you don't have investment people working in cities, in municipalities, and able to really share the story of a project in a way that makes giving the data that investors really need. So the next part of this then is a cities advisory, and this then basically not only looks at the project in terms of the information needed by investors on return rates and risks and de-risking and this kind of thing, but it also gives you an SDG readout of the project and how is this project delivering on SDGs. So in the portal, as projects then get more of this data, they're able to be more attractive for investment because the investors are seeing, okay, this is more the type of data that we're looking for. And then ultimately then we have vehicles that we're creating. And what these do is they put the sort of initial sort of first loss capital into a project. So if it's a 100 million project, they'll put in about 2 million because these are specialist vehicles that are familiar with emerging and developing economies. They're used to infrastructure. So they're putting in the initial capital to make sure all the due diligence is done, everything's sort of tied up contractually and everything like this. And once they've done that due diligence, then they're able to then invite in other investors to co-invest with them to make the capital stack needed to deliver the project. So, this is work in process. The portal is set up. We're trying to mobilize what we call a feasibility fund, so a philanthropic fund, so that we're able to have these advisors working to make sure projects are prepared well. And we have one or two investment vehicles that are being created at the moment and being capitalized. So this is something in process. But you know, we really believe though that partnership, you know, the funds are there, the projects are there, but we've got to work together in that space. Cities really need advice from the investment community on how a project can be presented to them, how a project can be prepared. And more than that, we need businesses to work even more upstream and to be able to work with cities to understand what an investment environment is, what are the expectations, what are the opportunities and the potentials, what are the sort of legislations that they need to have in place. So I guess my appeal then is for the business community to be working with small cities and working in that space of the upstream preparation and educating cities about what it takes to invest in the city. Last thing then, coming back to small cities, the other thing we're trying to do, and we hope to pilot this maybe in Latin America to begin with, I'll be in New York next week to talk to development banks, is the idea of aggregation. So we talked about 4,000 cities that have a population of 100,000 and above, you know, and people are looking at those little pipelines that they're developing and thinking, oh, it's not worth, I don't have the attention span to look at a small project in a small city, you know. But if we worked with several cities in one country, so we're starting with 10 in Ghana, but we hope to expand to 20 and then 30 and over time, if we can create then a national database of the local investment needs, then you can start aggregating them. So in other words, if you've got a tiny city that wants 6 buses, Well, I don't know who's going to look at those 6 buses. But if across 15 or 20 cities you need 300 buses, big and small cities, that's an interesting procurement. That's a very interesting investment package. You can launch that globally and get some really good deals. You'll get your buses much cheaper. And the same for street lighting, the same for waste compactors. There are so many things in cities that could be procured at scale if you could then create a framework for generating national databases of local investment needs. And the other thing we'd work with there is with ministries of finance to create then the national guarantee for subnational investment, because sometimes people don't invest in cities because they're not allowed to. And cities might be discouraged from working with investors because if they default, then that affects the national credit rating. So we also need to be working with our ministries of finance to see how can you create a national investment de-risking, investment guarantee system, a de-risking system. And the other opportunity, and I'm sure then with, and we hope to meet later here with the Minister of Finance, but I'm sure if you can create that, there will be development banks that are willing to help create such facilities. But I think importantly, you can create some conditionality on that as well. So you can say, well, if the investment is going to be a green investment, it qualifies for this de-risking guarantee system. So if it's a diesel bus, well, good luck with that. But if it's a low emission bus, you can qualify. If it's normal street lighting, that's one thing. But if it's solar street lighting, you can qualify. And this way, we could be then looking at the investment needs of several cities and clustering them together, grouping them into investment packages, but also using that de-risking thing to really encourage and incentivize a transition towards much more green infrastructure. So that's kind of where we're leaving it. We're at early stages. Just probably in a month's time, we'll launch the SDG Cities program for Ghana. But I'm just wanting to welcome partnership or even request partnerships so that if we can work more closely with the business community, understand more from their perspectives, well, the challenges you're facing in trying to invest at the subnational level, then I really think we can use this approach to get the dialogue needed and get the frameworks needed to be able to drive investment, sustainable investment in a way that can be transformative. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there. Thanks. Now is where I get a bit scared.
All right, thank you very much. So, thank you very much for that presentation. We'll take a few questions and contributions. Even right, Madam Vicky will go first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dyfred. I think this should have been the first day for you to introduce us to this, but thank you so much for making it. Because this conference is all about your initiative. So we're hoping that next year you join us fully and partner with us.
Thank you.
My question here is, how is your public-private partnerships? How are you engaging the public sector? How are you engaging the private sector in this initiative? I see that it's all over. It affects every industry. And so there should be a lot of work bringing together everybody. It touches on everybody's life, and we need a clean future.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And first of all, I also should mention, and she's not here today, but we're partnering with the UN Capital Development Fund. So they're these UN specialists on the investment side and on the finance side. And they're particularly focusing on sub-Saharan Africa and to really come up with good models of investment. They're actually working in Kumasi on a bus rapid transit system here. So we see finance as an ecosystem, and we're working with national development banks, subnational development banks, and regional ones. But in Latin America, for instance, the partner that we're really starting to figure out how to work with is what's called IDB Invest. So you have the Inter-American Development Bank, but they have the investment side. So this is the side of the bank that deals with the private sector. It's the same in Sao Paulo with Desenvolve SP, and I think what we're interested in is not necessarily those IFIs that are dealing with providing a loan to the government, but those ones that are looking to empower the private sector. So when it comes to this, we're trying to see if there's an ecosystem that goes from global level to local level. An example of this would be the New Development Bank, which is in Shanghai, which is a BRICS bank, working directly with Desenvolve SP, which is a Sao Paulo state development bank, which is then looking at aggregated projects, generating tenders, and working actually to provide loans even to the local banks, so that you can bring other partners into this ecosystem. So, yeah, sorry, there's two different lines that we're looking. One is to aggregate projects to a larger scale, and these are good for things like procurements, buses and streetlights and waste compactors and this sort of thing. But the other role is to empower the local finance sector. So how do we work with global development banks, to work with the subnational development banks, their private sector wing, to work with local commercial banks that can then be working with local businesses and help them to be successful in being capitalized so that they can tender for projects. And I think, and this is a very different model to the old model of global development banks loaning to governments, some of that then going to the subnational level, and some of them that getting down to projects. We want to be able to cut a lot of that sort of stuff that takes place upstream, so the capital is getting down and strengthening local financial markets, and then balancing that and creating partnerships then with local investors who are now empowered through a strengthened local financial market with international investors that can complement that work and create a solid investment case. So to me, it's about ecosystems of finance and bringing together a variety of solutions. This is the one I was scared of.
Scared of me? I wanted to know, you talked about the businesses, we as business owners working with small cities to educate them on, the financial requirements of investors. How do you suggest we do that effectively?
Yeah.
Like, what is your idea?
So what we're trying to do with this SDG Cities program is to make the process quite an engaging process. Like in Portugal, for instance, they've started to work with youth and children. They've created an SDG song and they've put a lot of energy into it. And we want to create energy around it so that people think it's actually in my interest to get involved. So it's not just businesses, but it's the youth of the city, it's the women of the city, it's the civil society of the city, but also the business, because we want to, the data collection, the data analysis, and the planning process, we're asking our mayors, and with this SDG Cities, we are asking mayors when they sign up to be committed to an inclusive process, and to be open about the problems and the challenges of the city, to be open about the governance system, and just to be a lot more transparent, so that businesses can get alongside and create to have working groups such as chambers of commerce or local business communities to really have that dialogue with the city, because so often the businesses, if they engage in a way too late, everything's kind of done and dusted, and if only the cities realized that you could do so much more. You can make such a better business model around mixed-use housing, and that actually delivers on so many different sustainability things. But they might not. They say, okay, this is a low-income residential community. Any investors? And nobody wants to go, you know? So it's so important that businesses are bringing in their perspective earlier. And this is why within our SDG Cities program, where we are asking mayors, we are only qualifying the mayors that are willing to engage businesses as well as other stakeholders in that planning process. So hopefully the mayor reaches out to you to say, be part of this. And that's our hope.
Excellent, excellent. And then I didn't understand what you were saying as far as empowering the local banks. What was that process? Could you go over that again?
So this is one we're looking at, we're exploring in Sao Paulo, so we haven't yet looked at that properly in Africa yet. But what they're identifying is that cities have kind of two types of projects. One is off the shelf, and the other ones are the ones that need to be built. And then probably within that, then there's ones that would be totally publicly financed, some of them that could be totally privately financed, and some of that requires some kind of PPP arrangement. So once you know the pipeline, and then you can start to categorize it and aggregate it and do different things with it, we want to be able to support local businesses to tender. And quite often they are lacking capital or a relationship with a commercial bank that can help capitalize them or help them to be able to tender. So then the idea then is not necessarily to invest in the businesses, but to provide financing for the local commercial banks, but training with them on how to support building the capacity of the local banking sector so that they're able to understand the risks better. They know what kind of credit that you could be offering to different types of businesses, and empowering those banks maybe also with second-tier financing and the rest of it. So it's very much the relationship between, say, subnational development banks and local commercial banks, and then the local commercial banks then being the kind of the interface then with businesses that are going to then deliver the projects.
So you fund the local banks, basically.
Yeah.
Coaching and consulting
building
the local
capacity
banks.
of the local banks.
Got
exactly. So then local businesses can say, hey, there's a project coming up, there's a tender, could you be a financial partner on this tender,
And now they have the guidelines that will assure.
And then they build a relationship with the businesses. So they've oh yeah, you were successful last time, we can step up this time. So I think it's really about empowering the local finance sector. I mean, UNCDF are doing other interesting things. They're generating municipal bonds, and they're generating water bonds, and for different things. They have different mechanisms. But essentially, we really think that if we see the opportunity for the private sector to be really advancing sustainable development, then we need to empower the local finance sector.
That's excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Nene. Please.
And this one's even more scary.
Thank you. I'm probably breaking all protocols as it is my boss who is standing there. My name is Hilde Upuku, and I wanted to use this opportunity to introduce myself because I will be the program manager for this program in Ghana, and I'm something as rare as a Norwegian Ghanaian. So, but I wanted to comment on the first question. So I don't have a question for David, so he can relax. I wanted to comment on the first question because we will put down a advisory board for the whole project in Ghana involving the 10 cities and then as it grows. And one of the seats on that advisory board should be represented by private sector. I don't know if that will be GIPC or somebody else, but we will find a partner that will represent the private sector, those interested in investment in the real estate and infrastructure as well on that board, which will be your representative in the process. Thank you.
Sorry, I was going to introduce you.